Welcome to the MSD Animal Health podcast. My name is Eleanor Brady and I'm Ruminant Veterinary Manager with MSD Animal Health. Today's podcast is all about abortion and sudden death in sheep, and we'll touch on controlling coccidiosis. I'm joined by Conor Geraghty, veterinary practitioner with FarmGate Veterinary Group. Conor, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your veterinary career to date?
Certainly, Eleanor. My name is Conor Geraghty. I own and run FarmGate Veterinary Group in East Galway, based in Mount Bellew. It's a 10-vet practice over 3 sites. We would be very mixed practice in large animals, and we'd have dairy clients and we'd have beef clients, but we have a lot of sheep clients. It's lowland sheep area, very intensive lowland sheep production. And ewes start lambing their pedigree flocks in January, and ewes are still lambing, so it's a constant feature of practice. And I suppose I'm 25 years qualified now almost, and I've been there for 24 and a half years, so that's my introduction.
Brilliant. So you said you see a lot of sheep in practice. What are the most common sheep call-outs then for you, Conor?
Well, it would depend on the time of the year, but in springtime, from January up to now, it's a lot of individual animals. So you're talking about ewes lambing, prolapses, sick ewes, and lots of sick lambs as well, because we have clinics and farmers tend to bring them in. And then once you go outside springtime, it becomes more flock-based problems. So you're talking about outbreaks of disease or outbreaks of scour, maybe with coccidiosis or worms, lameness outbreaks. We would try and help our farmers set targets to keep certain things under certain targets, so they might see some of those targets getting surpassed, and maybe call us in to have a look. So outside of spring tends to be a lot more flock-based, more larger numbers and data-based rather than individual animal calls. But I suppose maybe unique to the part of the country, or maybe unique to the practice, I'm not sure. I'm a sheep farmer myself, so we tend to have a lot of interaction with our sheep farmers, which mightn't be typical across the country, really.
In your 25 years then, Conor, have you noticed any trends or increases in particular problems in flocks? What are you seeing more of than ever?
Well, there's always changes in 5-year blocks, let alone 25 years. But I suppose for a start, we see that sheep farmers are probably becoming older, and those that are of the younger generations are less likely to accept things like abortion or things like ongoing lameness issues, which are highly labour intensive. They either want them fixed or the sheep are gone, and which is good from an animal health and welfare point of view. But I suppose then it brings us into the focus that we have to be able to solve these issues, and thankfully we have the tools and the ability to do that if we can work with the farmers. That's part of life. You have sheep, you're going to have all of these things. And I think that's the one change. So I think the people that are staying with breeding flocks will not take a chance, a punt, for the want of a better word, that you're going to have an abortion outbreak next spring and you're going to lose a huge amount of your lambs. They want it more planned than that. They certainly don't want outbreaks of lameness that's going to flare into 25%, because that doesn't fit in with their lifestyle. So and that's right and proper, and I think it's a welcome change from our point of view. Historically,
I think sheep farmers put up a lot with things like, say, abortion. Like the targets for abortion are below 2% for abortion itself and below 5% for infertility. Like a lot of farmers would have had a lot more than that in years gone by, but now you find that they're a bit more proactive about wanting to get on top of it. And then in terms of getting on top of an abortion issue in a flock, then Conor, what are you thinking about doing to get on top of it?
Well, setting the target is critical, and those targets can be difficult to achieve. But once you have them set, then it's a matter of making sure that you know whether you're reaching them or not. So that bit of data gathering and analysis, which doesn't take that long really. Because farmers tend to have round numbers, they tend to have 100 ewes or they tend to have 110. It's easy enough to work it out. You don't need an Excel spreadsheet usually. If they're not reaching their targets, then it's a matter of making sure that we try and identify why that is. And I suppose with our farmers, it probably started back maybe 7 or 8 years ago. We started doing this target stuff, and it coincided with knowledge transfer. And we discovered through running the data, we had about 120 flocks in it, 10,000 ewes or that, and that farmers that achieved their abortion targets were 5.5 times more likely to hit all their targets.
Oh, yeah.
So, because to get the mortality targets and the weaning targets and everything, they had to, if they had an abortion outbreak, they were going to lose lambs, obviously, but they were going to lose ewes as well because of the associated infections and, you know, lambing difficulties and weak lambs, etc. So I think that was very powerful for us coming back the year after as a way of explaining to farmers, if you want this to work, the first thing you have to do is to make sure you don't have an abortion outbreak in spring. And I think that's still as critical as ever. So that's where we come from. So what do we do and how do we achieve it? The key thing is anybody with abortions in spring, we encourage them to bring us the material. We recognise they don't have time to go to the lab or don't want to, or they're too busy. We'll take the samples, we'll send the submissions, and we'll find out. And if we discover an agent, an abortive agent in any of those samples, we'll put a reminder on our calendar to contact that farmer a month or 2 months pre-tupping, so that we can have that conversation again, because farmers forget.
Yeah.
They forget about the problems they had in March, but in June or late June or early July, we'll have that conversation with them, and then we'll try and bring them on. So, I mean, it was to a point, I think, when we were really humming with it in a core practice, and we did add some new clients since, we had almost eradicated the issue of dead or rotten lambs in springtime. That we were that successful with it. You know, farmers recognise that, because that is a significant issue, labour issue in springtime, is dealing with those ewes.
Yeah, and I must commend actually your practice for offering the service of taking the aborted materials and submitting them for the farmers, because obviously, you know, sheep farmers are busy, they mightn't get the time to submit these things to the lab. On the most recent All-Ireland Disease Surveillance Report, I know that in 2022 there was only maybe in the 400s aborted materials such as a fetus or placenta submitted to the regional labs. So, you know, it's obvious that farmers aren't getting the time to maybe submit those materials. So it's great that your practice...
We're taking the swabs, or we're sending some samples, and PCR has been a game changer. It's just to identify something. And I know that, you know, if you're in the middle of an outbreak and you might need to get something to the regional lab, but as a screening test, you know, as a way of doing something, it's very useful to send off those tissue samples for PCR and to get back a result. And it's easy to send them, and you don't have to send someone with a bag of smelly stuff to the lab. You know, you can just put it into a pot and send it off. It has been a game changer, and I suppose over the years, farmers might have thought that, you know, dog attacks or various different things were the cause of these ewes aborting. But in reality, if you send enough samples, you'll find out that in most cases it's an infective agent.
Yeah, like so things like enzootic abortion of ewes or Chlamydophila abortus obviously is the top abortive agent in sheep in Ireland. I think 27% of samples in 2022 were positive for C. abortus, and then secondly have toxoplasmosis. So most sheep farmers will probably know about those two big headers at this stage. When you have that kind of an outbreak going on, it's really vital that you get your fetus and your placenta to the lab, or to obviously to your practice, so that swabs can be taken. How do you deal with an outbreak of either of those abortive agents, Conor?
Yeah, because I mean, when I qualified, I'm reminding myself how old I am now, but when I qualified, like toxoplasma was the number one abortive agent, and enzootic abortion was only in a little corner of Northern Ireland at the time, and now it's the most common cause. So, and I think, you know, farmers, once they get something, once they're trained into something, they believe that a lot of these ewes are safe to keep again, because they're used to it being toxoplasmosis and they've been immune from there on. I think that's how we've convinced them to make sure that they drop us the samples, because it's important that if it is enzootic abortion, that it's going to get worse next year, not better. But enzootic is so common. We're still seeing plenty of toxo, but enzootic is so common. And the problem is that people would have maybe taken advice from their peers that if they have an abortion outbreak this year, that it's going to be it'll be grand next year. No, you know, it's a tough year, but it's over now, but next year it'll be better. But enzootic abortion, of course, as we know, is going to get worse. You know, that's what we're trying to prevent. You know, it can be done. It's difficult, but it can be done.
So in terms of enzootic abortion, it's definitely been, I suppose, brought into the country over a number of years, and it's very much a buy-in kind of a disease anyway. Then toxoplasmosis is more of an environmental kind of an issue. But in terms of EAE and toxoplasmosis, how do you normally recommend farmers control these diseases in their flock?
Well, in our practice, I suppose 90% of the sheep farmers, the serious farmers, are simply vaccinating their replacements, making sure that risk is gone. And then there's another cohort that are in, I suppose, what we call the recovery phase. So they've had an outbreak and they're in whatever phase, year 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 of post-outbreak. And they're on various strategies, whether it's vaccinate the entire flock for enzootic, whether it's vaccinate the replacements, whether it's vaccinate plus antibiotic cover at 100 days until there's no more abortions. So there's a sliding scale there of what needs to be done, and then of course there's the people that aren't vaccinating or maybe getting away with it up to now. So, but we'd have that obviously on the clinical notes, and we'd know exactly what the story is. And then I suppose it's the planning element of it then for pre-toping, because it creeps up on farmers. Toxo especially has to be pre-ordered, and that can be a crazy time as well, trying to get all that fitted in.
Yeah, getting prepared for the toping season and having yourself well prepared. I suppose in terms of like when you take vaccination out of the equation, controlling EAE technically is, not buying replacements. It's not bringing in new animals. A lot of people do buy in animals, which is maybe not that realistic for a lot of people. So the only real option maybe there is to vaccinate, especially if you're buying in. In terms of toxo, very hard to control. Yes, associated maybe with cat feces in years gone by, but also in the environment too, also found everywhere, very difficult to control as well. So vaccination with Enzovax, Toxovax, you've seen success stories definitely in your practice anyway with those two vaccines.
Absolutely, because with toxoplasmosis, you can't control the wild cat population. It's not always to do with straw. We've seen it outbreaks in paddocks, in the lambing paddocks. Farmers source straw wherever they can get it. The reality is, in my part of the country, most of that straw is bought in, so they don't have control over that. With regards to Enzo, I suppose the practical reality is if you're going to rear your own replacements, that means realistically, financially, you would have to lamb yearling ewes, which most of our lads have realised is, takes the fun out of lambing. So it's the simpler system in which at least 75% of our clients is they will buy hoggets, their replacements, a month, ideally before they go to the ram, to give them a chance to vaccinate them. And that works very well, because we have an older cohort of farmers that don't want to lamb ewes anymore, but they're quite happy to rear ewe lambs and sell hoggets, and both works very well. So I think that by buying those hoggets and vaccinating them with Enzo and Toxo seems to be the most practical solution to this issue, as we see it. Now, we have farmers obviously that breed their own and let ewe lambs to the ram, and they would just vaccinate the ewe lambs. Again, that works fine as well. But we have very few flocks that you could say are secure enough to say that they're Enzo free and aren't buying in.
I suppose technically buying from an enzootic free flock, you could do that too. But realistically, most people are buying something in at some stage.
Most people are, and most people buy it on the open market. And with the best will in the world, I don't think that knowledge is there about what flocks are free and what flocks aren't. So
I suppose making sure that you have your vaccine plan well thought out in advance of topping, and making sure, technically with Enzo and Toxo, you need to have, definitely Toxo into animals at least 3 weeks before topping, and then Enzo into animals at least 4 weeks before topping. So you need to make sure you have your plan in place before you start.
You do. So for the farmers listening here, we would say, you need to be contacting your vet 6 weeks pre-topping, to organise the plan. And for vets that are listening, I would suggest that, you know, it's probably time to go farmers to know how many vaccines they want about 6 or 8 weeks before the tupping date, because it does creep up and it causes all sorts of hassle if it's very short time. But they do need 3 weeks, and the Enzo needs 4 weeks, and it takes about a week and a half to get it in. So, you know, that's the guts of 6 weeks, 5.5, 6 weeks. You know, if it happens to be, and that's a long time in late summer when tupping date is approaching. So
the main, I suppose, take-home messages there for ovine abortion in general would be knowing what you have, so getting your samples into your lab or to your veterinary practitioner if they offer that service, such as FarmGate Veterinary Group do. Making a plan in advance and knowing what you're going to do well before you start even thinking about tupping.
Yeah, well, you certainly need all that sorted before you go to the Galway races anyway. So.
Yeah. And then I suppose if we move in, I suppose that the yearly calendar of, say, the breeding flock, so you're obviously tupping, then you have ewes that are in lamb, hopefully no abortions, no barrenness, no fetal resorptions, all the rest. You get to your lambing time and you have lambs on the ground. So when lambs are first born, Conor, what kind of diseases do you normally see?
Our target is, you know, less than 5% dead in the first week, less than 2% dead after that. That's a very tight target and it's very hard to achieve. I would suggest, you know, 10% is probably more realistic in the country, but it is achievable by some flocks, but it is difficult. So that 5%, like, that's lambing, deaths at lambing. It's injuries at lambing, you know, the broken ribs, the broken whatever else that happens. Ewes lying on lambs not getting a suck. And then you have your infectious diseases, which typically in that first 5 days tends to be reduced down to your E. coli, septicemia or watery mouth, and possibly some of the other, you know, naval ill type things. But we probably realise now that all of that is down to colostrum, it's down to ewe nutrition, it's down to the availability of help, of supervision at lambing, and the availability of space and hygienic bedding areas for those at the time. So, you know, I think most farmers realise this. So farmers that are probably tight for space would have the issue if the weather turns bad that week, that, you know, they'll be under pressure. But I think a lot of those farmers have tended to let their lambing days slip out, so that they're further away from bad weather. Once that is done, then, you know, you're talking about joint ill, navel ill, and then your clostridial diseases would be the next one that we would see. And that's typically around the time you put rings on. So again, some farmers will manage those young lambs by having the ewes boosted pre-topping, and we think that's the way to go. I suppose as we get on then out in the grazing paddocks, the next one then probably is coccidiosis. And that can be complicated then by the presence of nematodiris at the same time. So, you know, that again can be a conundrum that requires a vet to maybe check a few samples and check it out. But again, like everything else, you know, things have improved a lot, and lots of vets now have in-house machines for running those samples, and we can determine immediately whether it's coccidiosis or nematodiris. And, you know, that takes the guesswork out of it. So, yeah, I suppose we're just at that stage now, you know, that we're past that.
And then giving ewes a vaccine that covers Clostridial organisms and Pasteurella cover as well, 4 to 6 weeks pre-lambing, making sure that they have it in on time. Obviously the ewe's body needs time to respond to a vaccine in order to produce the antibodies that appear in the colostrum that initially protect the lamb. And then when that initial period of antibody cover finishes, then you're talking about boosting your lambs as well and continuing that cover. Yeah, so in terms of then Pasteurella cover, then Conor, you see a need for that as well in practice?
That's a very individual farm issue, because we would have flocks that you know, successfully use the 10-in-1 vaccine, like Trivax 10, and have no issue. And we would have other flocks that, you know, like to use Heptavac P. And if it's working, you know, I'm slow as a vet to tell people to change, because like, unless there's a a problem, because if it's working, it's working.
Yeah.
So we would see, you know, individual flocks have individual needs, and that depends. There's a whole range of reasons for that. Like with cattle, you know what I mean? Some sheds are better than others, and some setups are better than others, and some flocks have genetics that are hardier maybe than some of the maybe more continental type breeds. We would have suggested that maybe every dead sheep for 6 months should be submitted to the lab. And if you can convince someone to do that, eventually you'll get a pattern. And guarantee the first 3 will be oddball things that have nothing to do with any herd program. But over time, you'll find that, you know, Clostridial disease is probably up there with a lot of them, parasitic disease as well. So once you get that information, and then you are regimental with the primary and secondary boosters, you tend to find over the next 2 years that your mortality will come down. And it is a crime to see those real fast-growing lambs succumb to Clostridial disease early on. And, you know, outbreaks of Pasteurella are very disturbing for anyone that's seen them. And thankfully, they are rarer than they were now. But we wouldn't see as many. We tend to see it more in store lambs, really, rather than in ewes. But certainly, Clostridial disease is something that can be managed very effectively with a vaccine program, and it's the only way of managing it. So.
Yeah, so in terms of, I suppose, maybe thinking about a Clostridial vaccine program or anything like that, really the long and short is they need to go to their vet, such as yourself, and just think about what their needs are in farm. But Clostridial vaccines, definitely, in my own opinion, there's no cure for Clostridial diseases. So, you know, all we can do is vaccinate, you know.
Yeah.
What kind of, you probably see pulpy kidney maybe in young lambs, and then maybe blackleg out at grass.
Yeah, I suppose the first one you'll see is the hemorrhagic diarrhea, and sometimes that'll end up in an intestinal torsion. You know, and farmers say, well, a fine lamb died of twisted gut. And to me, that doesn't happen without some Clostridial involvement. And that could be oversimplistic, but that's, you know, I've seen flocks where that was common. And once you get the Clostridial vaccination in properly, that stops happening. It tends to be a gap then in farms where people want to sell off their lambs, and then when it comes near August again, vaccinate what's left. We try and keep it as simple as we can. Make sure that the replacements are vaccinated properly, first and second vaccines pre-tupping, booster then pre-lambing, and then see what the lambs need after that then. And that tends to work. Yeah.
So Pasteurella, I suppose, on the other side of the coin, yes, it can be seen, obviously, in pneumonia in any kind of age of sheep, whether lambs or older animals. You have 2 different syndromes with Pasteurella, so you might have animals with pneumonia, or you might have sudden deaths, like a systemic pasteurellosis as well. Do you see much of those, Conor?
See huge amounts of the systemic one in autumn. There's lots of our clients now are buying store lambs rather than keeping ewes, and that tends to be, you know, to eat off some grass or, you know, whatever. It's also a viable option for wintertime enterprise, and has been for the last number of years. So there's a good bit of that, and farmers are you know, they go out and buy these lambs 40 kilos. You know, they're intended to be short stays. You know, it's not really worth doing anything with them. Don't really want to dose them, don't want to dip them, don't want to do anything, because the withdrawal will be too long. And then, you know, all of a sudden the first thing that'll happen is you'll get an outbreak of Pasteurella, especially if you're buying mountain lambs. You know, we see those catastrophic events every year, and it's hard to look at. So, you know, that's a constant issue. Stress brings on that pasteurellosis. Store lambs, especially coming from mountains down to lowland, definitely a stressful event. During the year then, we would have ewe flocks that might have an issue with this historically, and they will always continue to use Hepativac P rather than take a chance. So, and that's why we say if it's working, leave it working, because, you know, some of these outbreaks may not have happened in my time. You know, it could have been 30 years ago, and if you stop, sometimes because they're happening again, so you don't want to do no harm anyway if you can.
So yeah, very much depends on the farm then, Conor, whether they need to cover with something like Trivax 10, which is purely broad spectrum Clostridial cover, or whether they need a vaccine like Hepativac P, which is Pasteurella cover as well as Clostridial cover. That's great. And then particularly this time of the year, I think you said it earlier, coccidiosis rears its head as well. What do you see of coccidiosis in practice?
Coccidiosis is something that can take you by surprise, and you may not see the signs that are typically associated with it, which is black scour or bloody type scour. And you can see just a general ill health in lambs. And I've seen this in my own lambs about 5 years ago in one particular field, and every day I went up, there was a sick lamb, and eventually I worked out through taking samples that it was coccidia, treated them, and it was like I bought a new flock of lambs by 3 days later. So coccidia in lambs tends to bring down their immunity, tends to make them prone to other diseases, as well as having that poor thrive and that black type scour, the prolapses that we would see. Farmers tend to know where this happens. So oftentimes it's a matter of trying to get in there and use the product like Vicoxin at the right time before you get the clinical disease, but after you get exposure. And I think that works exceptionally well, and farmers that are in tune to where the coccidia is on their own farms are able to manage that quite well. The complicating factor, I suppose, is mixing it up with nematode iris, and that's where samples are required, really. Farmers
normally know where their outbreak point tends to be, as you said there before, and then we expect nematode iris around the same time every year. It's a complicated situation to try and work out. Only by fecal samples, really, you'll know what you have.
Yeah, and it can, the nematode iris samples can be, because it can be pre-patent, you know what I mean? And again, I suppose that's where, well, in our own practice, speaking from ourselves, this idea of bringing the little dead lamb into the clinic, and in 2 seconds we can have them opened up and we can take a sample further up along the rectum or into the colon. We tend to get more nematode iris positives there than you would have trying to get a fecal sample. And sometimes you can have the two together. So sometimes you can have, because the nematode iris is there, the immunity to coccidiosis wanes, and you can have high levels of both. But if you're unsure, traditionally, I suppose farmers would have dosed for both. Mm-hmm. And that's quite expensive and probably wasteful, and with issues about resistance and everything else. So the availability of sampling now, and on-the-spot sampling or on that day sampling, makes that a lot easier to determine, if you have an issue, how to deal with it cost effectively and sustainably. So that's what we encourage our farmers to do. If you have lambs that are not thriving, or if you seem to have lost lambs, contact us immediately. Don't wait a week and wait for it to get worse. And I think that's how we try and get the targets down, is not to let the outbreak get too big before someone steps in. And it's a sensible way to do it.
And coccidiosis can be a bit of a funny one as well, in that most animals harbour coccidia. They'll have a low level. It's only when that level gets out of control, such as if you have other complicating factors such as stress or other infections like nematode iris, that's when things really get out of hand.
You can get nematode iris, you can get yellow runner's grass, mm-hmm. which is one of the more common ones. If you get a spring like this where grass regrowth is scarce, that can be enough to bring on the coccidiosis, because they haven't got enough milk or milk supplies back. So there are loads of complication issues, but I suppose farmers are out there every day. They know from looking at the lambs if something is wrong. And I suppose what we try and impress on farmers is, don't let that end up into a stunted lamb situation. If you think something is wrong, grab a few lambs, take a few samples, contact your vet and try and work out what it is.
Yeah, like the damage that coccidiosis can do to the intestinal tract is, if you see pictures of it, it's long-lasting damage to the intestines, and then obviously you get an impact on daily gains and thrive and everything really in that lamb.
Oh, farmers know this. Lambs like that, they get a setback, they'll have them for the whole year, whereas lambs that stay thriving, they'll be gone in June, and they have to leave a lot more money behind than the ones that are there eating creep until October or November. So yeah, this is sheep farmers know this, and it's a matter of having a plan in place to take an action when you see something wrong.
And then when you do suspect or have diagnosed coccidiosis, then Conor, what is your port of call there?
Yeah, we've been using Vicoxin for years in the practice, and we find it very good with sheep. It's some people know exactly, the lambs are going into the paddock that have coccidiosis, and 10 days later they'll gather them up and they'll dose them with Vicoxin. So, it is proven over time to be an effective product, and it probably was, when I first saw it, having seen practice in an era before Vicoxin and being in practice during it, it's been a game changer for vets to be able to cure coccidiosis. It was a bane of our lives before that, So, it's effective as long as you can get in there before you get that incessant straining that makes them into chronic cases. It's very effective.
So really, again, just about knowing your flock and knowing when you get your outbreaks, when to expect it, and making sure you have your dosing ready to go well in advance. Essentially, get your Vicoxin bought and
not to go too soon. And I suppose that's the key. Get the professional advice and make sure when you do buy it, that you get the maximum value out of it. And I think that's the way to deal with it.
Yeah. So timing is important there. Vicoxin only works in the presence of a rising coccidia, I suppose, population. So making sure you have the right time there, that you're obviously dosing the correct amounts for the correct weight. So having everything well thought out in advance and doing things by the data sheet or under the instruction of your vet is very important.
Exactly.
Conor, to finish up, what are your take-home messages for sheep farmers in managing sheep health this year?
Well, I think the key thing I would try and impress on sheep farmers, if you're a dairy farmer or a beef farmer, you have a target. So there are targets there, they're not very well publicised, but to see where you benchmark your own farm. So am I hitting targets on mortality? Am I hitting targets on abortion? Am I hitting targets on growth rates and fertility? So if you are, great, keep doing what you're doing. But if you're not, go and have a chat with your vet, not in the busy time. So when everything is settled down and you have all your figures there, and come up with a plan of where it can be improved over the next 12 months. And we've done that with lots of farmers, and they've always come back year after year to make sure that they continue doing it, because it makes life less crisis driven and more managed, and makes their flock more enjoyable, as that it's not a crisis that, oh my God, 30% of my ewes were lame this weekend, cancel the holidays, we have to go on footpath. You know what I mean? Things like that make life just a little bit more pre-planned. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us on the MSD Animal Health podcast, Conor. You've been brilliant, and there's a wealth of information there for sheep farmers to take home, I think, today. Thank you for listening to the MSD Animal Health podcast. Tune in next time for our podcast on managing and controlling lameness in sheep.